Chapter 1 Hatred, Discrimination, Racism, and Alien. Louisiana enacted an act known as the Separate Car Act, which mandated the separation of railway cars for black and white passengers. Homer Plessy decided to challenge this act, and Ferguson won the case. The act was then upheld as constitutional. On May 3, 1942, General DeWitt ordered that all Japanese Americans within the Seattle area report to designated assembly points for evacuation to isolated inland camps. Gordon Hirabayashi, the defendant, was accused of violating the curfew and exclusion order. Hirabayashi's lawyers appealed the conviction, and after the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco declined to rule on the case, it was brought before the Supreme Court. Although Hirabayashi has been convicted of 2 violations, they had been served concurrently, leading the justices to consider only the curfew. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was a significant law in the U.S. following the California Gold Rush, primarily aimed at restricting Chinese immigrants from entering the U.S. However, this contradicted the 14th Amendment, which guarantees birthright citizenship. The primary motivation behind the law stemmed from racist attitudes and the selfish perception that jobs were being taken away due to population growth. 15 years later, similar restrictions affected Japanese Americans, as Japanese immigrants were no longer allowed to bring relatives into the U.S., resulting in a significant decline in the populations of both Chinese and the Japanese in the country. This not only intensified discrimination against immigrants and white Americans, but as we explore later in the video, also led to the case of Korematsu v. United States. If the Chinese are allowed to enter this country and enjoy the same privileges as individuals from any other foreign land, they will educate themselves, conform to your laws and customs, and become good citizens like any other race. These quotes reflect a dialogue between Frank Pixley and Wang Chong, with one expressing racism, discrimination, and hatred, while the other seeks justice for their people. Chapter 2 One Court Case, Two Purposes. Fred Korematsu was an ordinary man born in California. He compared the exclusion order to the abhorrent and despicable treatment of minority groups by the dictatorial tyrannies which this nation is now pledged to destroy. He concluded that the exclusion order violated the 14th Amendment by falling into the ugly abyss of racism. Both his father and mother were immigrants to the U.S. One arrived through Angel Island while the other came directly. Ida Boitano was his girlfriend in 1938. Shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor marked the start of World War II. As Japan and the U.S. were at war, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which forcibly relocated Japanese Americans to internment camps. One might conclude that the reason behind this was due to their Japanese heritage, but why does that matter? Discrimination and racism between Americans and Japanese Americans could be the underlying cause. Tensions and jealousy between these groups has been escalating, and when the opportunity arose to marginalize Japanese Americans, they took it. But isn't it unjust to the Japanese Americans who did nothing wrong? Like Wang Chong, Fred Korematsu sought to reclaim the rights that had been stripped away from him. Japanese Americans want to live and have the same rights as anyone else. Korematsu planned to stay in his house with his girlfriend, but things didn't go as planned. He was arrested, bailed, then rearrested. Korematsu decided to file a lawsuit aiming to regain his rights as a citizen. Korematsu's attorney took a step towards ensuring due process before the trial began. He believed he was arrested primarily due to his Japanese heritage, not because of Public Law 503. As Korematsu awaited judgment in the Supreme Court, he wondered if he could win the case, reclaim the rights he was entitled to, and combat the discrimination against Japanese Americans and contribute to unifying our nation. But did anyone truly listen to him during the court proceedings? He was paying attention to the Constitution and he thought he had the rights as an American citizen. But the Fred Korematsu case is following its decision that it is based on race, and it certainly seems like the incarceration of Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans must be based on race, because how else would you decide to isolate peoples of certain descent but based upon their descent? In the hopes of preventing Korematsu from addressing his conviction, the government offered him a pardon. Korematsu responded, "I don't want a pardon. If anything, I should be pardoning the government." No, he faced a loss, with 6 people opposing him and only 3 giving ear to the pain of someone longing to belong. Despite their efforts, divisions and sectionalism remained, and differing cultures struggled to coexist. The 1988 Civil Liberties Act provided reparations and an apology from President Ronald Reagan to the remaining Japanese Americans for their World War II incarceration. This included $20,000 as compensation for their time in internment camps, which may sound generous until you realize the motivation behind it was to preserve the US's image. Japanese Americans, despite their treatment, still chose to support the military. These reparations were a response to the inhumanity shown by the government. Reflecting on the title of this chapter, while the court case was Korematsu v. United States, what relevance does it hold for our discussion? The case was about Korematsu taking responsibility for defending his people against horrific treatment, but it significantly influenced the fight against racism and the acceptance of differences. Consider the historical injustices like the Trail of Tears, the Battle of Bighorn, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the Gentlemen's Agreement, all stemming from cultural differences. The primary goal was to reclaim rights, and the secondary goal was to bridge the gap of discrimination and foster a sense of nationalism where everyone supports one another. Chapter 3: The Past Reflection in the Water. On September 24, 2017, President Trump issued Proclamation No. 9645, which banned most residents from 7 countries from entering the U.S. Despite the ban's anti-Muslim implications, it still passed with a 5-4 vote in favor. This parallels the actions of ICE, forcing immigrants to leave their homes. Korematsu's story resonates with our present. It's a narrative that needs to be heard, a tale highlighting the right to live, to embrace our differences, and how we continue to grow as a society. Chapter 4: Lessons Delivered by a Hero. On February 19, 1942, President FDR issued Executive Order 9066, stripping Japanese Americans from their rights and forcing them into internment camps. Fred Korematsu, a Japanese American, felt it was his duty to advocate for all Japanese Americans and filed a lawsuit against the U.S. government, claiming the order violated his Fifth Amendment right to due process and his 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. Decided in 1944, Korematsu v. United States was a landmark court case that encouraged others to speak up for their lost rights and laid the foundation for the 1988 Civil Liberties Act and Trump v. Hawaii. He took on this responsibility to ensure that history wouldn't repeat itself. Even with the ruling, he refused to give up because he wanted to stand up for his beliefs and what the Constitution represented. Throughout history, he sought to connect us through his experiences and promote acceptance. He teaches us that our differences are acceptable and that we shouldn't judge others based on them. Imagine a world where everyone remains distant due to race, where people mistreat each other because of their backgrounds. Korematsu's experience highlights the consequences of such discrimination, reinforcing this year's theme. Individuals have a responsibility to advocate for their rights, and everyone deserves those rights, regardless of their differences.